forest is never darker than during a storm, and inside a cabin, the walls feel too thin to keep the night away. The rain began at dusk, a steady patter at first, then a roar as clouds opened above the trees. The old cabin shook under the wind, its shutters clattering against the frame. You and your friend lit lanterns, sat close to the fire, and told yourselves it was only weather. But storms have a way of waking old places. The first crash was distant, thunder rolling across the sky. But the second was closer, a heavy slam against the front door, as though something hurled its weight against it. The wood shuddered, the latch rattled, and both of you froze. The wind howled, the rain whipped harder, but the pounding did not stop. Again and again, the door shook on its hinges, each blow stronger than the last, and then it opened. With a violent crack, the door flew wide, slamming back against the wall. The storm surged in, wind and rain whipping across the floor. Both of you rushed forward, shoving it closed, sliding the latch back into place with trembling hands. For a moment, the cabin fell still. The only sound was your ragged breathing. But then, footsteps. They came from inside, slow, measured, crossing the floorboards from the door to the center of the room. Yet no one had entered. You both knew it. You had seen nothing come through. The steps halted. Silence filled the room, pressing against your skin like a weight. Then, retreat. The same footsteps moving back toward the door. The latch rattled once, softly, and the cabin was still again. Neither of you spoke the rest of the night. The storm raged until morning, but its noise was easier to bear than the silence that followed the footsteps. At dawn, the sky cleared. The trees dripped with rain. The cabin steamed in the first weak sunlight. You packed quickly, leaving dishes unwashed, the firewood stacked by the door. The memory followed you down the dirt road. The way the door had flown open. The way something had entered, unseen and left on its own. The storm had passed, but the truth lingered. Something had walked through that cabin, and it hadn't needed the rain to hide its steps. Some cabins keep the world out. Others seem to invite something in. It was your grandmother's cabin. Remote, weathered, and quiet. The kind of place meant to hold memories of summers past, now standing mostly empty except for an occasional visit. When you arrived, the air was crisp, the yard covered in damp earth from recent rain. At first, nothing seemed unusual, until you saw them. Muddy footprints. They trailed across the yard, leading straight toward the front steps. They were not neat like boots, not clear like sneakers. They were wide, uneven, the edges blurred as if pressed by something heavier than human. The tracks stopped near the porch, right beneath the window, and then vanished. Later that day, while walking around the back of the cabin, your eyes caught something else. A patch of earth, disturbed. A hole, shallow, freshly dug. The soil still loose, the edges clawed, as though something had been pulled up or pushed in. No shovel marks, no tools, just raw digging. You told yourself it was nothing. Just the ground shifting. Maybe an animal, but that night, the sounds began. A faint tapping, like knuckles against glass. Not frantic, not loud. Just steady, testing. The sound grew into scraping, something dragging lightly along the wood siding, circling. Every pass seemed to stop, just short of the door. Sleep was impossible. The night became a blur of waiting, listening, heart pounding against the quiet. By morning, dread pulled you outside. The footprints were back, fresh again, though no new snow had fallen. and the hole, larger, as if something had been digging all night, determined, patient. The soil was scattered, clawed wide. You didn't stay. Bags were thrown into the car, doors slammed, engine roared. The cabin faded behind the trees, and with it, whatever secret the earth was holding. But the thought stayed, the footprints approaching, the restless digging. Not like an animal foraging, not random disturbance of soil. It was trying to open something. And if you had stayed longer, maybe you would have learned what. The forest floor is never truly still, but when the silence deepens, the world feels like it's holding its breath with you. It was the second night of a solo trip, the kind of journey meant to clear the mind, to trade screens and noise for the simplicity of fire, stars, and the hush of the woods. The tent stood in a small clearing, firewood stacked neatly nearby, and the pack resting inside. The first night had been uneventful, peaceful even. A fire, a meal, and the lull of wind through the branches. But the second night carried a different weight. The air was thicker, colder, and shadows stretched too far between the trees. Sleep came lightly, never deep. The body rested, but the ears kept searching. And then, a sound tore through the stillness. A thud. Heavy, solid. As though something large had dropped onto the ground just feet from the tent. The vibrations hummed through the soil, rattling the fragile stakes that held the fabric upright. Heart racing. The breath caught in the chest. Every nerve strained for the next sound. And it came. Slow, careful. Footsteps pressing into the earth. They circled, measured, each step dragging just enough to feel deliberate. Not the quick dart of an animal, not the randomness of a deer. This was different, purposeful. The sound curved around the tent. Left side, then back. Right side, then close. Too close. The air shifted. A slow inhale, then an exhale. Breathing, right behind the tent. It was so close, the nylon seemed to shiver with each breath. Warm, heavy, steady. The kind of breathing that was not just presence. It was waiting. Lying still, every muscle locked in place. Eyes wide in the dark. Not daring to unzip. Not daring to call out. Even the thought of moving the fingers toward the flashlight felt like betrayal. Like it would invite whatever lingered inches away to press closer. Minutes dragged. Hours maybe. The sound of that breathing etched itself into the silence. Then, just as it had come, it began to fade. One step, then another. Slowly, the weight retreated until the forest returned to silence. But sleep never came again. When the pale light of dawn spilled across the clearing, the tent was unzipped in a rush. The ground outside told no clear story, only faint disturbances in the soil, as though something heavy had shifted its weight nearby. No animal left those patterns. No person should have been there. The campsite was abandoned before the sun fully rose, gear stuffed hastily into the pack. As the path back wound through the trees, the silence of the woods followed, thicker than before. Because some things don't simply wander past. Some things come close, close enough to listen, close enough to breathe. The forest was silent, wrapped in stillness as the cabin stood alone in the clearing. And inside, two sisters thought they had found peace. They had come here to reconnect away from the noise of their lives. The cabin was small, rustic, with wood-paneled walls and a faint smell of pine. By day, it felt warm and inviting. Laughter filled the rooms as they cooked together, reminisced, and promised this would be the start of something new. But night has its own way of shifting the air. As the fire dimmed and silence settled, the narrator stirred awake. At first it was nothing, just the soft groan of the old cabin settling. But then, there it was again, a long drawn-out creak. Not random, not like wood shifting. This was steady, moving, step by step across the floorboards. For a moment, she held her breath. The sound inched closer. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking barefoot across the room. Her sister slept soundly in the other bed, unaware. And then it stopped. The doorknob rattled, not once, but again as though a hand, cold, patient, was testing it. The metallic click echoed in the darkness, every second stretching longer than the last. She wanted to scream, to wake her sister, but fur pinned her to the mattress. A terrible thought clawed at her mind. What if opening her eyes meant meeting what was already inside? Minutes dragged. The rattling ceased, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. She knew something was standing there, watching when the first rays of dawn touched the curtains. She didn't wait. She shook her sister awake, muttered something about leaving early, and packed with trembling hands. They drove away in silence, the cabin shrinking in the rear-view mirror, but deep down, she knew the truth. Whatever had stood on the other side of that door, it wasn't human, and it had been waiting. The snow fell quietly, softening the world into silence. But some silences are heavier than peace. They are warnings. It was meant to be a quiet weekend escape. A small cabin tucked deep in the woods, where the air was sharp and the ground blanketed in white. The first night was calm. The fire glowed, the tea steamed, and the outside world felt distant. But then, something stirred. It began with faint rustling beyond the walls. At first, it seemed like the wind brushing against branches, but the rhythm was wrong, too steady, too deliberate. When the sound pressed closer, a cold unease settled in the chest. Morning revealed the truth. Along the cabin's wooden siding were marks, deep, irregular scratches gouged into the surface. They weren't made by an axe or any tool a person would use. Number. These were uneven, jagged like claws dragging across the boards. The snow should have covered any sign, but there, leading away from the cabin, were footprints. Fresh, clear, pressed deep into the powder. They didn't look like boots. They were longer, wider, stretched strangely, almost dragging at the toes. The tracks led straight into the trees. That night the cabin was locked tight, curtains pulled, every lamp burning. But unease gnawed through every shadow. Hours passed slowly. Every creak of the wood made the heart jolt. Finally, unable to bear it, they packed in haste. The car engine growled against the frozen air. They drove through the white wilderness, tires crunching over ice. But just before the tree line ended, the eyes caught movement. There, at the forest's edge, stood a figure, still watching. The shape was swallowed in shadow, tall and indistinct. But the knowledge sank deep into the bones. It had followed them. The cabin was far behind, but the dread remained. The woods had shown its secret, and something had been watching all along. Old cabins carry memories in their walls, but sometimes those memories are not entirely gone. The cabin had been standing for decades, weather-worn, slouched slightly on its foundation, its roof patched and repatched over the years. It wasn't elegant, but it was cheap, and it promised quiet. For two people needing a short escape, it was enough. The first evening was simple. Dinner on the old stove, Laughter over cards, the soft hum of wind against the siding. Tom, your brother-in-law, was practical, steady. He joked about the age of the place, but his eyes lingered on the corners where shadows gathered too easily. Night fell heavier than expected. The woods swallowed sound, leaving the cabin wrapped in an unnatural stillness. That's when it started. A thump, sharp, sudden, against the outer wall. Both of you froze, listening. But the silence that followed seemed to erase the sound, as if the woods refused to acknowledge it. Minutes passed, just when comfort began to return. Another thump, louder this time, followed by a scrape. Something dragged across the siding. Long, deliberate, like claws or metal pulling along the wood. The sound crept slowly from one side of the cabin to the other, circling, tracing the walls with unnatural patience. You and Tom stared at each other in the dim glow of the lantern. Neither spoke. The only thing louder than the scratching was the beating of your hearts. The night stretched on like that. Thumps, scraping, silence, then more scraping. Hours bled into restless moments until exhaustion finally pressed the eyes shut. Morning revealed the truth. The outer walls bore marks, fresh, raw gouges carved into the wood. Some ran long, jagged lines, others dug deep, as though something had tried to tear its way inside. On one wall near the window, strands of torn fabric hung loosely, caught on a splinter. It wasn't yours. It wasn't Tom's. It was something left behind. Neither of you spoke much as you packed. The car was loaded in tense silence. The cabin left behind without a second glance. Days later, the story came out. The cabin wasn't just old, it was known. Whispers in town told of disappearances tied to that place. Families who never returned. Hunters who went missing without a trace. The thumps, the scratches, the torn fabric. They weren't just noises in the night. They were echoes, signs of something that had been there before, and something that hadn't finished its story. The woods have a voice of their own, soft, endless, and alive. But sometimes that voice falls silent, and that silence is not natural. It was supposed to be a simple night under the stars. One tent, a small fire, and the kind of solitude that city life never allowed. The clearing was quiet, the trees rising like dark sentinels all around. By sunset, the air turned cool, and the flames of the campfire painted shifting shadows across the forest floor. At first, it was peaceful. A meal cooked over the fire, the faint crackle of wood, the slow fading of twilight. Alone, yet not uneasy, just a kind of calm that comes when the world feels paused. But then, the fire died down. The woods seemed to breathe differently. The night pressed in thicker, heavier. Still, there was nothing to fear, not yet. Zipping up the tent, the world outside was left to its own silence. Hours later, something changed. A sound, dull, steady, pressed against the quiet. Heavy, slow, footsteps. The first step crunched faintly against the ground, followed by another, then another. Each one closer, each one measured, as though something circled with intent. Lying still, the breath caught in the throat. The thin nylon walls of the tent felt suddenly fragile, paper-thin between flesh and whatever moved outside. Around it went, one slow path circling the tent. The steps were not quick, not frantic. They were deliberate, almost as though something was studying, weighing its distance, testing its presence. The sound stopped, directly behind. The air shifted. A faint exhale carried through the fabric. Breathing close, impossibly close. Slow and heavy, with a rhythm too controlled, too unnatural. Every instinct screamed not to move, not to breathe, not to reveal awareness. Time stretched unbearably long. Every second pressed into eternity. And then, silence again. No steps moving away. No branches breaking. Just a suffocating absence of sound. Hours passed in fear. Eyes fixed open in darkness. When the first hint of dawn painted the clearing, trembling hands unzipped the tent. The world outside looked unchanged. Trees, snow, silence. But the sense lingered. Something had stood just inches away, breathing on the other side of that thin barrier. The campsite was abandoned in haste, gear stuffed into a bag, firewood left behind. The clearing would not be visited again. For some places do not welcome company. And some things circle in the dark, waiting for those who dare to sleep.